The pursuit of decentralization reforms assumes the presence of local organizations through which at least some features of resource governance can be institutionalized and exercised. But there is huge variety in the nature and origins of local organizations. For the identified cases of decentralization, the local organizations through which reforms are implemented vary widely in their origins. Many local organizations predate a given decentralization reform, but the greater majority have been either created afresh or modified so substantially that they are clearly different from earlier organizations. Traditional community-based and government-created local organizations, that's the first two columns in the table, represent the vast majority of the organizational forms described in the reviewed studies. Government-created organizations represent the greater proportion of institutions for both fisheries and irrigation. And in contrast, traditional community-based ones are the dominant form for grazing-related decentralization reforms. In some cases, governments may have created local institutions or local organizations far back in history. And certainly, a clear distinction between traditional organizations and state-sponsored new ones is not always valid. For example, the National Irrigation Authority in the Philippines supported the creation of irrigation groups at the local level as part of a modern decentralization reform. Similarly, a series shows, working on coastal management in Malaysia and Indonesia, how decentralization of coastal management in these two countries built on already existing organizations and thereby supported and revitalized such management authorities. The key elements in enabling such reinvigoration of local decision-making bodies was their legal recognition for management practices and decisions and removal of competing village administrative law institutions that had eroded coastal management norms. Collectively, these studies underscore the importance of adequate external central support to new and traditional organizations for them to be successful in shaping local actions. When local resource management bodies receive only minimal central support, do not have resources for enforcement, and are in conflict with other central organizations or centrally supported organizations, their lack of authority leads effectively to open access and precipitates crises and conflicts, as Ratner points out for Cambodian fisheries. Interactions between central states and local organizations are, of course, not a monochromatic picture of relentless aggrandizement of power by the center, or a rosy dawn of more effective participatory and downwardly accountable local organizations. A careful review of the institutional mechanisms that connect central and local authorities shows the limited utility of views that see in decentralization either a means to extend power or a benign transfer of powers. So what are these mechanisms of policy influence? They are highly varied, but they can be broadly grouped into three types. Decentralization reforms that seek to change actions and outcomes at the local level by changing incentives, by providing or taking new information, or by creating new institutional forms. Local level actions and outcomes, so I'm just trying to explain what I mean in this particular diagram. They can be changed by focusing directly on and creating new incentives. So if you think of FES schemes, they're a prime example of governments using just incentives, not necessarily creating new institutions, to change local actions and behaviors and outcomes. So policy actors can directly reward or penalize households and communities for the kinds of actions and behaviors they adopt. Subsidies or taxes and different kinds of sanctions are examples of direct incentives that can be used to change local behavior and actions so that desired outcomes can be encouraged. To achieve lower harvesting levels or lower illegal harvesting levels from fisheries, central governments can introduce compensation or sanctioning schemes without changing local organizations. Or they can provide incentives for acquiring new occupational skills or subsidize the learning of new trades to reduce pressure on resource systems. Lack of information about appropriate management rules or about patterns of resource distribution can be a deterrent to specific types of resource users. In such situations, decision makers can launch initiatives that enhance awareness to through new information or training programs that achieve the same objective. Decision makers at higher levels can also create or facilitate new local organizations and institutional arrangements that require collective mobilization or actions by different social groups or actors. Further, and these are the arrows that reciprocal arrows, further, institutions, information, and incentives are clearly related to each other. Direct provision of new information or incentives can create new institutions or new organizations. And new kinds of local institutions nearly always also provide new incentives or information to their constituents. Figure 2 summarizes the above argument about the relationship between policy actions and how such actions influence local behaviors and outcomes. So this is a very sort of schematic view of how different mechanisms link policy action with policy changes and institutions of actions at the local level or at lower levels. Table 2 provides, this is, I'm not sure, can you see it at the back? No? Yes? I see some, okay. So I tried to increase it as much as possible, but as we were looking for these studies, there's just such a huge diversity of different ways in which governments try to connect, that even this way, so this is actually a reduced form version, very abstract version of how these mechanisms, or what kinds of mechanisms they use. But even this, I could have easily put 2 pages of these if I had been more specific. So Table 2 provides a more elaborate listing of the ways in which central governments connect to localities. And to gain a better sense of how these mechanisms work simultaneously to enhance powers and capacities of local decision-making units, and yet limit their autonomy, it's useful to examine the specific mechanisms a little bit more. Information mechanisms typically involve new ways of exchanging and moving information. They include multiple forms of reporting mechanisms. The creation of constitutions or approval of local management plans is frequently a prerequisite for the official transfer of rights and responsibilities to local levels. These management plans and activities allow different levels of government to connect to each other and for higher levels to influence planning and to ensure that local institutions or local bodies are meeting their responsibilities. Information mechanisms can improve accountability and transparency and provide better knowledge for decision makers. For example, Mongolia's 1994 land law requires local governments to submit annual land use reports on their progress to the central government. This facilitates increased transfer of information across levels of governments and provides the central government with annual updates on activities in the localities. At the same time, this information can also be used to revoke local authority, not necessarily in Mongolia, but certainly in other places it has been used to revoke local authority and dissolve local user groups. Thus, on the one hand, local users receive information about their resources and how better to use them, enhancing their capacities. On the other hand, they provide information on the strategies and practices of use that can be deployed by central decision makers to change the incentives and outcomes, thereby limiting their autonomy. The second set of mechanisms are a combination of information and incentive mechanisms, and consider as examples of these training and capacity building efforts the capital enhancement activities undertaken by central governments. Efforts to connect central and local agencies better often rely on improvements in human capital endowments and knowledge of local decision makers, as also by provision of new infrastructure. In addition to informal advice and assistance that higher level government officials provide, more formal education and training is also often used in many cases to strengthen local capacities to monitor and or assess resources. Repeated visits to localities by centrally appointed government officials are common as a way to promote better skills. In many cases, training occurs at multiple levels to ensure that appropriate skills are available throughout the chain of decision-making hierarchy so as to permit accountability and oversight across the different levels of government. National officers train regional officers who are upwardly accountable, regional officers train and give advice to district officers, and district officers approve or train village-level decision makers. Central governments can also appoint officials to serve at the local level to improve interactions among local institutions, increase monitoring of resources, or generally build greater local capacity. And in some cases, higher levels of government appoint community members to serve as resource monitors or collect information. In a review of irrigation systems in West Africa, Norman et al. Described the potential complexity of such arrangements. The Central Irrigation Authority places a systems director at each site to oversee system operations, collaborate with farmers, and serve monitoring and policing roles, while a farmer-designated water guard is supervised by the systems director and is upwardly accountable to the government systems director.